Being selfish, Brooke. That's what this family does. We show up for each other, and right now you're not showing up. My mother-in-law said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, the way you'd explain something obvious to a slow child. I was standing in my own kitchen, still in my scrubs from a 12-hour shift at the accounting firm where I'd been doing their books since before she even knew my name, and she was explaining to me what family meant. I set my keys on the counter. I didn't say anything. I had learned a long time ago that saying anything only gave her more material. What she meant by showing up was this. My husband's younger brother, Dex, had just lost another job, the third in 2 years, and my mother-in-law, Patrice, had decided that the solution was for my husband Callum and me to cover Dex's rent for the next few months while he got back on his feet. Just like we'd covered it the 6 months before that, just like we paid off the credit card that accidentally went to collections. Just like I had quietly handled the $11,000 in back taxes on Patrice's condo in 2021 because she'd cried in my living room and said she didn't want Callum to know how bad things had gotten. She knew. She knew I wouldn't say anything to Callum because she'd asked me not to. She knew I'd pay because I always paid. She'd built her whole financial life around the certainty of me. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days finding the money people tried to hide. I knew exactly what everyone in that family owed me. I had a spreadsheet. I'd had it for 4 years. Not because I planned to use it, but because when you spend your career following the numbers, you can't help but keep count. The total, as of that Tuesday in March, was $94,300. I poured myself a glass of water and listened to Patrice explain why family came first. My husband sat at the kitchen table and nodded, because he always nodded. Because agreeing felt easier than the alternative, because somewhere along the way Callum had learned that peace in his family was a thing you purchased and I had been the one paying the bill. I said, I'd think about it. That was the last lie I told that house. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I loved Callum. I did. He was the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee, who showed up with soup when you were sick, who texted you just to say he was thinking about you. In the private life we had together, away from his family, he was good. He was present. But there was a version of Callum that only existed around his mother and brother, a version that went soft at the edges, that forgot the things we had agreed on, that could look me in the eye and say, I know, just this once even when we both understood it was never just once. I had tried. I want that on the record too. I had tried 3 separate therapists, 2 of them couples therapists. I had tried the direct conversation, the gentle conversation, the crying conversation. I had tried writing it out in a letter. I had tried saying nothing at all and waiting for him to notice. He noticed. He always noticed. And then nothing changed. The Tuesday Patrice came over was not the first bad day. It was just the day I finally did the math on something that had nothing to do with numbers. I was 31 years old. I had been married for 4 years. I had given this family $94,300, not counting the meals, not counting the weekends I worked to cover for the money that had gone to people who would not have done the same for me. I'd given Callum everything I had, and what I had gotten back was the version of him that nodded. I thought about my grandmother. Her name was Vera, and she had been the only person in my life who had looked at me like I was something to be proud of. She had died the year before I got married, and she had left me something. Not a fortune. A house in Asheville, North Carolina, which had been in her family since the 50s, fully paid off, along with a brokerage account worth $280,000 and a savings account with $45,000 in it. She had left it all to me and only to me, with a handwritten note that said, "You always knew what things were worth, baby girl. Don't let anyone talk you out of that." I had not touched any of it, not a dollar. I had kept it completely separate, in accounts that predated my marriage and had never been commingled with our joint finances. I had a good attorney and I had read the prenuptial agreement we had never signed very carefully, which is to say I understood exactly what I had and what I had protected and what was mine. Patrice did not know about the house. Callum knew it existed in a general way, the way you know a cousin lives somewhere in Ohio. He had never asked about the details. I had never asked about the details. That Tuesday night, after Patrice left, I lay in bed next to my husband, who was already asleep, and I thought about Vera and what she would have said about the spreadsheet on my laptop. I thought she would have said, "You already know what to do, you've known for a while." She would have been right. I did not blow anything up. I want to be clear about that too, because this is the part people get wrong when they imagine how these things go. There was no screaming, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where I threw something across the room. I was a forensic accountant. I dealt in documentation, in paper trails, in the quiet and irrefutable language of records. I started the week after Patrice's visit, not out of anger, out of clarity. The first thing I did was call my attorney, a woman named Frances who I had worked with professionally for years and who knew more about my financial situation than my husband did. I told her I was thinking about separating. She told me what I needed to do and in what order. I took notes the way I always took notes, numbered, organized, with a column for follow-up. The second thing I did was transfer the conversation about Dex's rent into writing. I sent Callum an email, calm and specific, laying out what we had spent in the past 2 years and asking if we could agree on a cap going forward. I kept the tone neutral. I was not trying to start a fight. I was creating a record. He read it and didn't respond for 3 days. When he did, he said, "I don't think this is the right way to handle family stuff." I replied, "How would you like to handle it?" He didn't answer that either. The third thing I did was open a new personal checking account at a bank where we had no joint accounts. I had Frances review whether my paycheck direct deposits were considered marital property in North Carolina. They were, technically, but my personal account from before the marriage was not, and neither was anything in it. I did not move any joint money. I moved nothing that wasn't already mine. I was careful in the way that people are careful when they've spent a decade watching other people be sloppy. I also made a quiet phone call to Patrice's condo association. I had been the one to deal with the back tax situation 2 years earlier, which meant I had been the one to correspond with the county assessor's office, which meant I had copies of everything, which meant I knew that the repayment arrangement we had set up had been quietly abandoned after the first 3 installments. I didn't do anything dramatic with that information. I just made sure I had it. The thing about Callum's family was that they had always treated money the way some people treat oxygen, as something that just existed around them, that would always be there, that required no particular thought or gratitude. Patrice had grown up with some wealth, not significant wealth, but enough to establish a self-image that her actual bank balance had never quite caught up to. Dex had inherited the self-image without even the starting capital. Together they had constructed a life that looked, from the outside, like comfortable middle-class stability, and which was, from the inside, a system of transfers that ran almost entirely in one direction, toward me. I had understood this intellectually for years. What changed that spring was that I understood it emotionally too. There's a difference. Intellectual understanding is how you stay. Emotional understanding is how you go. In April, Callum told me his mother had mentioned the possibility of Dex moving into our guest room, just for a few months, he said. He was looking at the floor when he said it. I said, "We've talked about this. We agreed no one was moving in." He said, "I know. I just think she's really struggling." I said, "We always think she's really struggling." He said, "She's my mother, Brooke." I said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. That night I called Frances again and told her to start the paperwork. I told Callum on a Sunday morning in May. I had made coffee. I had chosen a Sunday because there was no work, no excuse to leave before we'd said what needed to be said. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and I told him clearly and without drama that I wanted a divorce. He didn't yell. He went very still, the way people do when they've been braced for something for so long that the actual arrival of it is almost a relief. He said, "Is this because of my mother?" I said, "It's because of us." He said, "What does that mean?" I said. It means I've been trying to get your attention for 4 years and I'm tired. He cried. I had expected him to. I did not cry. Not right then, not in front of him. I had done my crying earlier. In private, in the months when I was still deciding. He asked if we could try again, another therapist. I told him we had tried. He asked if I would wait just a few months, just to see. I told him I had already filed. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Did you already talk to a lawyer?" I said yes. He said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said, "I've been hoping it wouldn't be necessary for 4 years. I've been planning it for about 3 months. He was quiet. Then he said, "My mother is going to be devastated." And right there in that sentence was the entire marriage. I moved out 2 weeks later. I had already arranged it, a short-term rental in a neighborhood I liked, close to my office. I took what was mine and I left what wasn't, and I did not make it dramatic. Francis had been very clear about the importance of not being dramatic. What I did not tell Callum, and what Francis advised I had no obligation to tell him, was that I was planning to move to Asheville permanently. I had Vera's house. I had already been in touch with a firm there that had been trying to recruit me for 2 years. I had taken the job. I was leaving Charlotte in September. The divorce proceedings were relatively clean. We had a prenuptial agreement after all, the one I had drafted in my head every time I paid someone else's bill. Legally, we had kept most things separate. There were some joint assets. Francis handled them. Callum had a decent attorney, but he was not particularly aggressive. Partly because he was still hoping I would change my mind, and partly because he was a fundamentally decent person in a situation where he had simply failed to be strong enough for long enough. Patrice, however, was not decent. Not in the way she chose to handle it. She called my office twice. I didn't take the calls. She emailed me a letter, 2 pages. That was equal parts accusation and manipulation, the kind of letter designed to make you feel guilty for having been wrong. She told Callum I had always had an agenda. She told people in their social circle, people who were only peripherally my social circle, that I had been secretly planning to leave for years, which was not untrue, but was presented in a way that made me the architect of something cruel rather than someone who had finally stopped volunteering to be a foundation. The most significant thing she did was contact my firm. I don't know exactly what she said. I know she called the main line and asked to speak to someone about financial irregularities involving an employee. I know because my managing director, a man I had worked for 7 years and who trusted my work completely, called me into his office and told me himself. He was not alarmed. He found it notable enough to mention and not credible enough to act on. He asked if there was anything I wanted him to know. I told him the situation. He nodded once and said he was sorry I was dealing with it. I thanked him, and then I did something I should have done 2 years earlier. I handed him a folder. Inside the folder was a complete summary of the $11,000 back tax situation with Patrice, including copies of every communication, every payment confirmation, every document that I had been the one to handle. It documented not just that the situation had existed, but that the repayment plan had been abandoned, and that the condo had been refinanced in a way that suggested someone had taken out additional equity while claiming financial hardship. It was not an accusation. It was context. It was what accountants call documentation. I told him, this is why she called. I wanted you to have the full picture. He looked at the folder for a long time. Then he said, noted. Patrice did not call the office again. The will reading, if you want to call it that, was not a single dramatic moment. It was a process. But there was one day that I will think about for the rest of my life. It was a Saturday in August, 3 weeks before I left Charlotte. Francis had arranged a meeting to discuss the final division of the few joint assets Callum and I shared, a joint savings account, some furniture, a car that we had technically bought together. We met at Francis's office, which was professional and neutral and had good lighting. Callum came with his attorney. Patrice came too, which was not standard, and which Francis had the receptionist note for the record. She sat in the waiting area while Callum came into the conference room. I don't know what she expected to accomplish by being there. Moral support, maybe. A front row seat. We settled everything in about 40 minutes. Callum was reasonable. His attorney was professional. I signed what I needed to sign. Frances signed what she needed to sign. At the end, Callum's attorney mentioned, almost as an aside, that they had become aware that I had significant assets and accounts predating the marriage and wanted to confirm they were not subject to equitable distribution. Frances said they were not. The attorney said they would want documentation. Frances slid a folder across the table. It contained the complete financial history of every account in my name, every dollar tracing back to before the marriage, every asset from Vera's estate with clear documentation of original ownership, every account that had never been commingled with marital funds. It was a forensic accounting of my own finances, which I had been maintaining since before I even met Callum, because I had always understood what things were worth. Callum looked at the folder. He looked at me. I could see him doing the math in real time, adding up the house in Asheville and the brokerage account and the savings and understanding for the first time what he had been adjacent to for 4 years and had never thought to ask about. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then his attorney said, "I think we're done here." And we were. I walked out through the waiting room where Patrice was sitting. She looked up when she saw me. For a second, I thought she was going to say something. She didn't. I don't know what she read in my face. I wasn't performing anything by that point. I was just done. I kept walking. I drove to Asheville for the first time as a resident on a Thursday in September. I had a moving truck behind me, and a coffee in the cuff holder, and a playlist Vera would have liked. The house on Linwood was exactly as I remembered it from visits as a child. The same porch, the same oak tree in the back that she had hung a wind chime in, the same kitchen where I had done my homework on the counter while she cooked. I sat on the porch steps that evening and watched the light change on the mountains. I had a new job starting Monday. I had an empty house full of Vera's furniture and the beginning of a life that belonged only to me. My phone had been quiet for weeks by then. Callum had stopped texting after the final paperwork came through. Patrice had gone silent after the phone call to my office. Dex had never had my number. I thought about the spreadsheet, $94,300. I thought about all the Tuesdays I had stood in my kitchen and my scrubs and listened to someone tell me what family meant. I thought about Vera's note, "You always knew what things were worth, baby girl." There was a wind chime still hanging in the oak tree. When the evening breeze came through, it rang, soft and clear, exactly the way I remembered. I had spent 4 years maintaining someone else's house. I had finally come home to my own. Some people will tell you that cutting the cord is the hard part. They're wrong. The hard part is the years you spend convincing yourself you shouldn't have to. I still think about that wind chime sometimes. The way it rang when the evening breeze came through the oak tree, soft and unhurried, like it had been waiting for me to come back and finally hear it. People ask me if I regret the years, the $94,300, the spreadsheet I kept for 4 years and never once showed anyone. And honestly, I don't think regret is the right word for what I feel when I look back at all of it. What I feel is something closer to recognition. Like I can finally see the shape of something that was always there. What I understand now is that what happened to me wasn't random. It followed a logic I helped create. Every time I paid a bill without saying anything, I was teaching people that silence meant yes. Every time I absorbed someone else's financial disaster without consequence for them, I was confirming that the system worked. Not for me, for them. The money flowed because I let it flow, and I let it flow because somewhere along the way I had confused being needed with being loved. Those are not the same thing. It took me 4 years and nearly 6 figures to learn that lesson clearly enough to act on it. But here is what I also know. I was not a fool. I want to say that plainly. I kept records. I understood exactly what was happening. I had an attorney. I had protected my grandmother's estate before anyone thought to ask about it. That wasn't luck. That was something I had built deliberately, quietly over years. A habit of clear thinking even when everything around me was designed to make clear thinking feel unkind. Doing the right thing for yourself is not selfish. Understanding your own situation with honesty and precision is not coldness. It is the foundation that everything else stands on. When Patrice called my office, she was counting on the same thing she had always counted on: that I would be too afraid of conflict to defend myself. She miscalculated because she had never actually understood who she was dealing with. And that brings me to the thing I think about most now, sitting on that porch in Asheville watching the light change. It would have been very easy to stay. The path of least resistance in that marriage was to keep paying, keep absorbing, keep telling myself that things would improve. A lot of people take that path. I understand why. It is exhausting to hold a boundary with people who keep pushing on it. It costs something every single time. What kept me from taking that path was not stubbornness, and it was not anger. It was the slow, stubborn refusal to believe that this was all I was worth. Vera had believed something different about me. She had said so in writing. I decided eventually to believe it too. I'm not going to tell you that leaving was easy, or that the life I have now arrived fully formed the moment I signed the divorce papers. It didn't. I spent months rebuilding things that had gotten quiet inside me, but I can tell you that the version of me sitting on that porch, the one with a job she chose, a house that belonged to her, a life nobody else had a claim on, that woman was not built from luck or from inheritance. She was built from years of paying attention, from refusing to let grief make her reckless, from holding on to her own clarity even when everyone around her was rewarded for her confusion. That's the thing about knowing what things are worth. It doesn't just apply to money,